Imagine you were suddenly transported back to 1942 and you were given the choice of which aircraft you could go to war in. Would you choose the P-38 Lightning or the de Havilland Mosquito? Let me take you through a few things I would consider with the benefit of hindsight before I made my own decision. And you never know, by the end of the video, you might even change your own point of view. Now, seeing that this is a P-38 and Mozzie video, it's going to be a long one, but don't worry, there's lots of things for you to think about along the way. And first of all, let's consider how these two aircraft came into existence. The Lockheed P-38, dubbed the Lightning by the British, and the de Havilland Mosquito were developed within a couple of months of each other. Nevertheless, they debuted with their respective air forces within a year, due to several reasons. While one aircraft was welcomed with open arms, but later underwent teething problems, the other was met with a lack of confidence and then became the most sought after aircraft in the RAF. Lockheed, a fairly new player in the fighter production, had suffered numerous rejections from the United States Army Air Corps when it answered specification X608 in 1937. This specification called for an aircraft that could reach a speed of 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, while remaining full power at that altitude for at least an hour. A rapid climb to altitude was also important. To put this in context, one of the best fighters the US could rely on at the time, the P-36 Hawk, could reach a top speed of just 265 miles per hour. If asked, many contemporaries would not have thought Lockheed capable of producing a fighter to meet these requirements, but their company president, Robert E. Gross, was not one of them. He gave the green light to Lockheed's chief engineer, Hal Hibbard, and another young employee called Clarence Kelly Johnson, who immediately began designing the prototype. Quickly, Hibbard realised that no single-engine aircraft could meet the specification, and so a twin power plant would be needed. Eventually, the design was narrowed down to a few configurations, ending finally with a twin boom design to handle the engines and superchargers, with the pilot seated in a nacelle in the middle, just as the Mosquito would be. The P-38 prototype was built in great secrecy, and it could be argued that the XP-38's initial performance justified Lockheed's investment of over $600,000 of its own funds to produce it. When first flown, despite some aerodynamic issues, the prototype lived up to the design team's wildest expectations in terms of speed. When the military learned of the results, they were so impressed that they supported a decision to reveal the new aircraft on the world stage as it attempted to beat the speed record set by Howard Hughes. It turned out that this would be one of the worst decisions in aviation history. On February 11th, 1939, test pilot Lieutenant Benjamin S. Kelsey attempted to fly from Marchfield, California to Mitchell Field, New York as quickly as he could. During the flight, the average ground speed he achieved was 420 miles per hour. Lockheed were well on their way to smashing the record and making their aircraft the most desirable fighter in the world. Unfortunately, due to engine problems on the approach to Mitchell Field, Kelsey ended up in a sandpit on the Coldstream golf course 2,000 feet short of the runway. The culprit was carburetor icing, which is now something every modern student pilot is taught to manage at low engine settings. The result was that the only P-38 prototype was destroyed. A test pilot was bruised and embarrassed, and Hughes still held the record by just 17 minutes. Nevertheless, Lockheed received orders to produce the P-38 for the US military. This was both a blessing and a curse. With the loss of the only P-38 in existence, the design team was effectively put back 2 years in terms of its development. What this meant for the Lightning as an operational aircraft was that issues that should have been ironed out in the design shed were being encountered by young men fighting for their lives over enemy territory. More on this later. The Mosquito, which was the brainchild of de Havilland, went into development just a year after the P-38, though it wouldn't get the full support of the government until the outbreak of World War II. Through the company's earlier experiences with their Albatross and Flamingo twin-engine designs, Geoffrey de Havilland was sure he could improve on an earlier specification, P-13/36, which had given rise to the Avro Manchester. Over a couple of years, and with lots of back and forth with the Air Ministry, interest in his design grew. In January 1940, the Air Ministry issued specification B1/40. This latest specification called for a bomber capable of reaching 397 miles per hour at 30,000 feet and was written around the de Havilland 98 design. And in case you didn't quite catch that, yes, while the P-38 was initially designed as a bomber interceptor, the Mosquito started life as a bomber. The bitter fighting of the First World War had shown that air power would play a significant role in any future conflict. The concept of the bomber will always get through heavily dictated bomber design and tactics throughout the 1930s. As bomber development began to outstrip fighter performance, for example in the case of the Bristol Blenheim, the desire for faster and faster bomber aircraft grew. This is why de Havilland hit upon the idea of a bomber whose only defence would be its speed. This was very distinctive from other bomber concepts such as the Boeing B-17, which relied on heavy defensive armament. As speed relies directly on the overcoming of weight by thrust, building a light bomber was crucial. Twinned with the high demand for traditional aircraft construction materials and de Havilland's earlier successful racing designs, they opted to build with wood. Imagine walking into the Air Ministry and pitching a design for a bomber aircraft built from spruce and plywood that wouldn't have a single gun aboard. You can imagine the reception that the de Havilland team received. It was because of its radical design that the Mosquito could be said to have been delayed in its development for nearly 2 years. The Air Ministry was very much opposed to any undefended bomber and demanded that defensive armament in the form of gun turrets or manually controlled rear-firing guns be installed. The Air Ministry also disliked the idea of a two-man crew, instead asking for a third man to be added to the crew to help manage its tasks. De Havilland refused, rightly believing that their plans for a bomber and fighter bomber variant to be the best way to develop the design. Relenting, a new specification was written around the existing design in January 1940, and in March and May orders were made for reconnaissance and long-range fighter variants respectively. The first flight of the prototype Mosquito, which had been given its name in June 1940, was made in November of that year. This isn't surprising, seeing that a team had been secretly working on the design, including an armed version, since October 1939 under the leadership of Eric Bishop. The birth of the Mosquito is a confused and precarious course which could well have seen the beloved British aircraft left on the floor of the design room. Ultimately, it was the prospect of a fighter variant of the Mosquito that could be said to have saved the entire project. Unbelievably, the Air Ministry then went on to tell de Havilland to prioritise the construction of the de Havilland Tiger Moth over the Mosquito, a request that was no doubt overturned by early 1941. So it could be said that both the P-38 and Mosquito had quite different starts, but once put into operational service, the two aircraft received very different receptions. While the Mosquito generally blossomed as a fighter, bomber and long-range reconnaissance aircraft, the P-38 very nearly was grounded entirely. No aircraft leaves the R&D lab perfectly formed from day one. Adjustments and redesigns are always called for. This is why prototypes exist, and if you happen to lose your own prototype in a ill-advised publicity stunt, it's hard to iron out these little but deadly flaws. Two of the biggest issues that faced the P-38 made it one of the most undesirable aircraft to fly for US pilots just entering the war. One of the hardest things a new pilot needed to master when flying a modern fighter in the early 1940s was torque. The tendency for an aircraft to drift to one side or the other could lead to accidents on takeoff and landings. When you have a twin-engine aircraft, you can counteract this by having each propeller rotate in a different direction. This was one of the things Lockheed learned for definite to do after the British specifically asked for right-hand rotating engines and then promptly rejected the resulting version of the P-38 as unsuitable. So the P-38 didn't have the same issues as P-51s or P-47s in this regard. However, the problem for a P-38 is that when an engine failed on takeoff, suddenly that torque cuts in and the aircraft invariably flipped on its back. Many inexperienced pilots died in this way, and the emergency procedure to deal with the issue was never finalised until after the war. This was the first thing that made pilots wary of the P-38. Another issue was its tendency to become uncontrollable in a steep dive. This first occurred in early 1941 when Major Gilk encountered serious trouble while diving his Lightning at high speed from an altitude of 30,000 feet. Gilk survived the experience through brute strength, but compressibility could have ripped his tail off, as it did with other P-38s. Compressibility is not unique to the P-38, but it certainly put the wind up new pilots who were being checked out on the type. Eventually, both these issues and more were solved with subsequent variants and improved training. Once the rumours died, the numerous advantages of a P-38 began to shine through. Unlike the Lightning, the Mosquito suffered very few teething problems during its early introduction to operational units. Something it shared in common with the P-38 though was its slow production. Lockheed had been surprised by how many orders it received for the P-38 and had to expand into an old whiskey distillery to cope. It was said of the Mosquito that its only flaw was that there was never enough of them to meet demand. If you're enjoying the video so far, please give it a like to help it spread to others, and also consider supporting the channel by going to calibanrising.com/support and see how you can help me produce these videos. While trying to compare the P-38 and Mosquito, the elephant in the room is of course speed. The Mosquito is often quoted as being the fastest aircraft in the world, or at least the fastest piston engine aircraft. However, that wasn't the case as the war went on and as the aircraft was developed. If you look at the early versions of the Mosquito and P-38, you can clearly see that the Lightning was faster. A P-38E had a top speed of about 415 miles per hour. While the most produced variant of the Mosquito, the FB Mark 6, had a top speed of 380 miles per hour. To put that in context, the Focke-Wulf 190A2, which was coming into service around the start of 1942, had a top speed of 410 miles per hour, and the 109Gs, which were introduced around the same time, could get up to about 426 miles per hour. Both the P-38 and Mosquito could outpace the Spitfire 5, which could only reach approximately 369 miles per hour. Not only do I adore both these aircraft due to the added safety they provide with a spare engine, but also because they both pack an almighty punch. In the days where Britain and the United States operated predominantly only machine gun armed fighters, the P-38 was something of a unicorn. By the time it entered service, the P-38 had to be the most heavily armed single-seat fighter the Americans had, with one exception, boasting 4.5 caliber machine guns, which any Spitfire or Hurricane pilot would have been grateful for. It also had a 20mm cannon. Another important factor of the P-38's design was that the central nacelle allowed all 5 guns to be mounted right in front of the pilot. This meant that no convergence was needed. When the trigger was pulled, the shells could be fired directly to the target. This gave the P-38 a devastatingly tight area of fire, which could extend forward until the bullet started to drop off. The night fighter and fighter bomber variant of the Mosquito had almost the exact same layout of its armament. It boasted 4 20mm Hispano cannons mounted below the crew compartment, which extended into the forward bomb bay area. In addition, it had 4 .303 machine guns in the nose. Now feel free to debate me on this in the comment section, but I think the Mosquito may slightly have the edge on the P-38 here, despite those additional 4 pea shooters. Both aircraft could also be fitted to carry other armament too. The P-38 and Mosquito had variants that could be armed with self-propelling rockets. One Mosquito variant, called the Tetsu, was fitted with a 57mm Molins gun for anti-shipping operations. What both aircraft had in common was their impressive bomb capacity. The P-38 could be fitted with up to 4,000 pounds of bombs. Let's remember that the B-17, one of the mainstays of the 8th Air Force, would usually carry around 4,800 pounds to German targets. American pilots put this impressive bomb capacity to great use in the Pacific theatre in particular. The Mosquito, first conceived as a bomber, also had an impressive bomb capacity. Bomber variants were able to carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs in the internal bomb bay. This was done by adapting the length of the 500-pound bomb. Fighter bomber variants could also carry 2 500-pounders in the rear part of the bomb bay and an additional 2 under hardpoints on the wings. However, this wasn't a common configuration for this type. A later variant of the Mosquito could also carry a 4,000-pound cookie bomb and deliver it to targets deep inside Germany. So again, there's not that much to choose from in terms of armament for these two aircraft. Though the two aircraft would be used on their first operational missions in different theatres, they would eventually both be used all over the world. The P-38 claimed its first victory near the Aleutian Islands in August 1942, and then 10 days later the second over Iceland. The Mozzie was used for its first sortie, a reconnaissance mission, the previous September. Range was always a factor in the missions the P-38 and Mosquito flew. Although first conceived as a bomber interceptor, the P-38 would find itself used as the first long-range fighter available to the Americans. At the high altitudes of these missions over Europe, the Lightning came into its own and was a real match for the German fighters, earning its Teutonic moniker, the Forked-tailed Devil. The P-38 eventually reached a maximum range of 2,600 miles with the use of drop tanks, but it had a total combat range of about 450 miles. These extraordinarily long legs would have the biggest impact when the type began to be used extensively in the Pacific. One of the biggest contributors to the extreme range that the P-38 could achieve was actually civilian Charles Lindbergh. If you want to learn more about this, please watch my full video on him, which I'll link to above. The Mosquito also had pretty long legs and was able to carry a pretty big punch, either in terms of bombs or guns, right into the heart of Germany. Depending on the variant and use of drop tanks, the Mosquito could comfortably fly a 1,500-mile mission and often conducted numerous long-range trips in one night. So in terms of range, the P-38 certainly had the Mosquito beat. But before rushing to be checked out on the Lightning, you might want to consider what the extreme range might feel like sitting in the cockpit. If you've ever had the opportunity to get up close and personal with the World War II era aircraft, you'll notice that they are roughly finished inside. Only the most necessary equipment is installed, and the pilot's comfort was never the priority. While American fighters tended to be a little bit more spacious and logically laid out, one could argue, they were just as rustic inside. Although Mosquito crews felt just as cramped and chilly as P-38 pilots on long missions, temperature seems to be a common complaint that comes up among the American pilots. Captain John Lee, a 5-kill ace, was generally appreciative of the P-38 as a fighting machine, but in an interview complained about the aircraft's heater. It simply didn't work. He explained that the Air Force attempted to improve the frigid temperatures of their high-altitude fighter by issuing electrically heated flight suits. Again, Lee explained that these only heated one, if somewhat crucial area, the pilot's fanny. I'll just give a moment for my British viewers to stop laughing there. When the P-38s were eventually sent out to relieve struggling P-39s and P-40s in the Pacific, the opposite problem revealed itself. Early variants of the P-38 didn't allow the pilot to lower the side cockpit windows without risking extreme tail buffeting. So pilots were forced to sit in a sweltering cockpit due to the Pacific heat. Now I can personally relate to that, as I'm an expat currently living in Taiwan and recording this in a pretty hot box room office. This issue, as with many others with the P-38, started to be phased out by the L series of its development. Perhaps one point in the column for the Mosquito, in terms of crew comfort, was the fact that you weren't flying alone. While the P-38 pilot may have experienced up to 9 hours of monotonous flying, perhaps even under radio silence, the Mosquito pilot had a navigator to guide him, and perhaps a mate to steady his nerve upon the moment of action. Another quick point from the perspective of ease of flying these aircraft concerns the undercarriage. The Mosquito was a classic tail dragger, which most aircraft of the period were. Pilots learned from day one how to handle an aircraft with this landing gear configuration, and perfected the ground handling and landing skills needed. Still, when landing in tail dragger, there is always the moment where your entire forward view is blocked by the nose. This happens when taxiing as well, or when taking off. The P-38 had a tricycle landing gear configuration, which is pretty much ubiquitous in modern general aviation aircraft. From my limited experience of flying in a tail dragger and then getting my own flying license, I can tell you that landing a P-38 would have given you much better visibility of your surroundings than a Mozzie. One of the best advantages of hindsight is the ability to assess which of these two aircraft was the safest to operate in combat. There was something like 10,000 or so P-38s built during the war, and around 8,000 Mosquitoes. Of course, those are very rough numbers. To determine how many of those aircraft were lost through enemy action is a little bit beyond my capabilities as a lowly tubeturian. However, we can think of a few distinct factors that may have affected survivability in these two aircraft. Although the P-38 eventually proved itself a deadly adversary with developed tactics and its deadly armament, things didn't start that way. When used against the Axis forces in North Africa in 1942, the P-38s were at a distinct disadvantage in terms of being outnumbered and outclassed. The P-38 was fast, but when operated at altitudes below 15,000 feet, it was totally dominated by the smaller and more manoeuvrable German fighters. This was the same fate it faced if it ever tried to dogfight with Japanese fighters in the Pacific theatre. Being a P-38 pilot at low altitude over Africa or Europe, and especially under 300 miles per hour over the Pacific, was a death sentence. If you were unlucky enough to get shot down, bailing out of a P-38 was no picnic either. Once you had opened your canopy, which involved rolling down the side windows in earlier variants and popping the main canopy, you couldn't just jump out. It was feared that the slipstream would carry a pilot straight into the rear stabilizer, either seriously injuring him or killing him outright. Instead, as the stricken P-38 fell from the sky, you had to shimmy your way down the wing and only jump clear once the risk of hitting the tail was gone. Bailing out over Europe or Africa, a pilot had a good chance of evading capture or at least ending up in a relatively safe prisoner of war camp. As much of the P-38's operational career happened in the Pacific, surviving a bailout risked torture and death at the hands of the Japanese. In the case of the Mosquito, the crew either sat directly over the exit hatch in the bomber variant or next to it in the fighter variant. This suggests that bailing out of this aircraft was a tad easier. What's more, the Mosquito, anecdotally, had a very low loss rate. Although I don't have hard-cold numbers, one source suggests the combat loss rate of as little as 3%. This may be an exaggeration, but seeing that the Mosquito was largely operated at night and often as a predator itself, the number seems quite acceptable to me. As fighter aircraft, the P-38 and Mosquito performed very differently. The Mosquito, probably due to its bomber origins, was not an outstanding day fighter. Despite its stellar night fighter reputation, against single-engine German and Japanese aircraft, the Mozzie was vulnerable. Ultimately, this is why it was rarely used as an out-and-out fighter, and didn't appear in the long-range escort role. Although one of the fastest aircraft in the war upon its operational debut, by 1944 many Axis aircraft could outpace it, and outmaneuver it. What's more, the cockpit and canopy configuration meant that the aircraft had numerous blind spots. Despite all this, a Mosquito that found itself in a fight with a single-engine fighter could live to tell the tale through its excellent evasive manoeuvring. Of course, any engagement that ends in a dogfight can cautiously be called a failure. When a Mosquito caught an enemy unawares, its armament would soon reduce it to a fiery wreckage. The P-38, in comparison, was a better day fighter. With its far superior canopy design, the pilot had a good view of the battlefield. It had better acceleration and climb rate than the Mosquito in a fight, as well as a better roll rate. It is clearly the better choice if you wanted to be a fighter pilot and tangle with the enemy. As a night fighter, the Mosquito was outstanding. It shot down at least 600 enemy aircraft at night and could be used for defensive or offensive night operations. The P-38 also saw some use as a night fighter. In 1944, Lockheed converted a P-38L as a two-seater night fighter. Radio equipment had to be relocated and machine guns were equipped with anti-flash muzzles. It had a top speed of 406 miles per hour, and after successful trials, an order was given to Lockheed to convert an additional 75 P-38s into night fighters. The aircraft were painted glossy black and entered service just before the end of the war. When choosing between flying in the P-38 or the Mosquito, and indeed fighting in it, we might also want to consider the theatre of operation. Both aircraft were used on every front the Allies fought on, almost without exception. However, they didn't perform equally well on all of them. The P-38, although one of the only American fighters to be produced throughout the war, did not truly reach maturity until the very end of the conflict. Although most of the accounts I've read and the interviews I've watched say the P-38 was a perfect aeroplane, I feel that time has smoothed over some of the rougher memories. The P-38 was a state-of-the-art war machine and had a lot of complex systems to manage, just like many of its contemporaries. However, the engine management system was perhaps a little more complex than the Merlin-powered Mosquitoes. For example, to increase power quickly, it was first necessary to increase the RPMs and then advance the throttle. The mixture setting might also have to be swiftly adjusted after a period of cruising, especially if jumped by an enemy. Doing so in the wrong order could lead to detonation in the engine, which would eventually lead to engine failure. The Allison engines were also susceptible to the cooler temperatures of high altitude flying in the European theatre, which led to many P-38s returning to base with engine trouble before they got into combat. The lack of suitable octane fuel and inadequate oil that the American squadrons experienced in Britain also hampered the P-38's effectiveness on operations. This happened to such an extent that when Doolittle took over command of the 8th Air Force, he relegated the P-38 to the Pacific Theatre in favour of P-51s and P-47s. Interestingly, after P-51s replaced the Lightnings, the kill ratio went from 1.5 to 1 to 7 to 1. Ironically, when the P-38 arrived in its new theatre of operations, it really came into its own and secured its place as one of the best fighters of World War II. To my knowledge, the Mosquito did not suffer similar issues with engine problems or the effect of altitude and climate on the engines. One thing to note though is that in the heat of the Pacific, the glue that kept the aircraft together in many places had a habit of coming unstuck. However, I wasn't able to find any accounts of this leading to failures in flight. If you have any stories to share, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Of course, you could argue that these aircraft were purely tools, something to get the job done. So why do they capture our imagination as they do? It has to be those exceptional stories of the missions carried out by the pilots who flew them. Perhaps the most famous mission flown by P-38s occurred on April the 18th, 1943 and was codenamed Operation Vengeance. The Americans had a score to settle, and it would be the Lightning that would make it happen. Nearly 2 years before, the US had been attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, and the man behind it was Admiral Yamamoto. By 1943, the Americans had been able to crack the Japanese naval code and had learned of an impending tour of the Solomon Islands by the Admiral. A plan to intercept and, to put it bluntly, assassinate Yamamoto was hatched. To avoid detection, an attacking force flying from Guadalcanal would have to avoid flying over Japanese-occupied territory before launching the attack. This would call for a 1,000-mile round trip. The only aircraft capable of carrying out this mission was the P-38. So 18 aircraft from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned, and they successfully shot down the Betty bomber carrying Admiral Yamamoto. This mission, although supposed to be secret, was what established the P-38 as one of the best fighters in the Pacific. The Mosquito, in addition to its work as a long-range reconnaissance aircraft, a night fighter, bomber and pathfinder, is probably best associated with the daring missions it performed at low level over occupied Europe. From bombing Gestapo headquarters, to disrupting high-ranking Nazi speech givers, to busting out resistance fighters from jail, they are the stuff of a Hollywood producer's wet dreams. Of course, they were not all flawless operations, and if you want to learn more, check out all my Mosquito videos on this channel. So perhaps we could say in these terms, the Mosquito was possibly a little bit more dashing than the P-38. The Mosquito was one of the most versatile military aircraft that has ever existed, and was used for almost every role available from mine layer to air taxi. Not only was it a potent war machine, it was also a propaganda marvel. Used in some of the most iconic missions of the Second World War, the Mosquito helped inspire generations long after it was decommissioned. If you are a fan of the Mosquito, then please consider helping fund the restoration of the next flying example by going over to peoplesmosquito.org.uk and donating or making a purchase. The P-38 is also one of the most iconic warbirds the Americans produced during the conflict. It was the aircraft of choice for the top scoring American ace, Richard Bong, who scored all of his 40 victories on the type. Despite initial teething problems, the P-38 would go on to be an excellent fighter and fighter bomber, and enjoy a racing career in peacetime. So given the choice, which aircraft would you want to go to war in? Leave your answer in the comment, and also add any additional information you think I might have missed. And if you made it this far, please give the video a like and check out the next video I've made for you on screen.